Yes, right. That's right. I mean, it is there's something sort of ironic, I suppose. This is a smaller point, but that the ideology, the philosophy that guides the sort of right wing that is in ascendancy right now, a kind of Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan has spoken of his affection for not only Ayn Rand but also philosophers like Hayek. These are sort of philosophers of the market. Now, there's a certain irony in that the belief here is that government cannot do certain things. Only the private sector can. And yet, in the election, you still say, but it's Obama's fault that there's unemployment. You sort of see the irony there. I mean, really, realistically, precisely those right-wing philosophers would say there's actually very little a president can do, or indeed should do, they would say. So there's a certain hypocrisy there. Well, I mean, it's very hard to know, like, how we can get out of this this sense that what we always need to do is just get the economy moving again. Especially since our economy is all it's all contingent upon growth. In other words, not just making profit, but making more and more profit
every quarter.
Yeah, I mean, I was just reading a little article in the business section of the New York Times about Fender guitars. Everyone would think, the most famous kind of guitar in rock and roll, everyone plays them. How could they be in any trouble? Surely they can. And in fact, looking into the article, they sell their guitars. They sell plenty of guitars. They just don't grow as a company. They're just not selling more and more guitars. And so, like, why is it not enough to
sell just guitars? A lot?
Yeah.
It always has to be more and more. Yeah, that's I think it's like a destructive attitude to have when you're beholden. I mean, this is how corporations work, and as they're defined, I mean, just legally is you have to be beholden to shareholders, and you have to maximize profits, and you have to continue to grow and compete and to really undermine the market.
Well, I think, maybe you're thinking of, there's a sort of paradox in capitalism in that sort of it's all about companies getting bigger.
Yeah.
And yet, this has been talked about. But
it's supposed to be competitive too?
But also competitive. So there's a motion to monopoly capitalism, which then, in a way, overturns the very competition that is supposed to be what makes this system healthy.
Yeah, exactly.
And makes it good. It's very hard to say, what is capitalism? And I think many times there's a certain odd mistake where anything that looks like a market is also capitalism. I'm not sure that is true.
Yes.
For Marx, the essence of capitalism was as a mode of production. Right, was as a way of, and in particular, in this case, a mode of exploitation. It's a structure for pumping economic value out of workers. And here, by the way, I might pause to say, because I think it's really worth saying, I'm not an economist, but everything I've ever read suggests that American workers have been for many decades and continue to be extremely productive. They are among the most productive workers in the world. In that case, what happened to all the value they made? Where did all that value go? All these decades of productivity.
Why
is our society poorer?
Yes, exactly.
Why are we doing bake sales to support our high schools? And why? What happened to all that value?
Yeah, where's our social spending? Where's our educational spending? Right? No, that is like the sort of fundamental question is, how are we in such an economic downturn, yet we're one of the richest countries and we're still productive? And
yes, I think honestly,
and there's a large wealthy elite.
Yes, I don't want to, sound conspiratorial here, but it does seem to me, I mean, those on the right very publicly for many years have spoken of starving the beast, which is a euphemism for getting the government in financial trouble so that social programs will have to be cut. And it seems to me that's essentially what happened here. We have such small, short memories in America, but we did have a surplus when Clinton left office. Clinton spoke about that at the Obama's convention the other day. I'm glad someone at least mentioned it. I mean, so really, President Bush squandered a surplus. He did so on two, to my mind, useless wars, and on tax cuts for the rich. So it's no mystery, really. And then, of course, there were lots of things happening on Wall Street that exacerbated the problem, deregulation and so forth. So it seems to me rather clear. And I don't mean to suggest that in some conspiratorial way people in a room planned out exactly what happened. But I do think that structurally speaking, and being powered by a somewhat frank desire to actually eviscerate government, to starve the beast. And it seems to me that Bush's policies therefore had, so to speak, what could have been their anticipated consequence.
Yeah, whether or not there was any groups of people that were conspiratorial, it seems as though their clout was not nearly enough to cause what our system has become. I think it's definitely just the way institutions are naturally selecting and naturally working that seems to be the reason why we're in this situation up. Because, yeah, like Brian and I always make this joke where we say, or Brian makes the joke, he says, people aren't getting underneath a volcano and planning evil secret plots all the time. But if we don't change the way we're thinking and the way we're viewing our nation or viewing our institutions, then we're just going to continue on this sort of downward slope. So, yeah, I think the natural choice for a solution to some of our ills would be, one, a much more progressive tax system to sort of pull us out of these shenanigans we've been in lately. And I read that the new president of France has passed it's as high as a 75% income tax on the nation's rich there, to pull sort of France out of this austerity measured future that it was going to face. And so I think naturally, if we want to even be somewhat serious about redistributing the wealth, that the tax codes for the wealthiest corporations and the wealthiest rich have to sort of drastically increase, even if it's short term. I think there's really no technocratic or political agenda that's going to pull us out that's any more effective than just taxing and ending subsidies for the most wealthiest companies.
Yes. Well, in the short term, I of course agree that we need more progressive taxation. And I mean, to go back to that hypothetical question I raised about, where did the value created by American workers go? Well, I think one knows where it went. It went into the
offshore accounts and things.
Smaller and smaller numbers of people.
Yeah.
And so we are returning to something like the so-called Gilded Age, the late 19th century. I mean, where, more and more power in the hands of a smaller and smaller elite. We speak again of the 1% famously this year, and that is a worrisome situation. It seems to me it should actually be worrisome, interestingly, even to someone who is a great supporter of capitalism, in part for the reasons we were talking very briefly about earlier, but that you start to wonder, what is the end game, even from their point of view? In other words, from the Paul Ryan point of view, we cut taxes on the rich and so forth. Well, what does our society start to look like? Does it start to become a kind of aristocracy almost, a kind of radically bifurcated, economically split society, maybe with a small elite of rich, a kind of medium-sized technocratic class, and then everyone else, in sort of dead-end, jobs or on unemployment. I mean, one wonders whether that could be, a sort of end game for America, given that if we, proceed along the same lines that we're going now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems as though we're looking sort of more like China in a way, even though China's supposed to be this spooky communist country. I think they're actually no less capitalist than the United States. And I also think that we're going to have a sort of inequality of income and empowerment that will probably sort of mirror China, where you have, our population won't be as big, but you'll have 90% of the population just has no social mobility, really. You live out in the farms, and then you might travel to the city to work in a factory for a while to save up just to go back to where you were, and not really hope to empower yourself in your community or empower yourself politically or socially or anything like that.
Yes. And, again, just from the standpoint of mainstream politics, it will be interesting to see. It's already been suggested. I think Paul Krugman said this, wrote this, that if Obama should win, as is starting to look like he might, although who knows, it's still very close, that in fact be, at least on a small scale, a kind of vindication for the power of government to do good. I mean, it was interesting that in that notorious blooper, or if that's what it was, that Romney being caught talking about about the 47% and so forth. He also said that these people, that he can never get their vote, they think that they are entitled to services from the government, to which I felt, and why not? Is this not government of the people, by the people, and for the people? The government is something that we created as a way of organizing our society and our lives. Why shouldn't we feel entitled? It's ours. It belongs to us.
Yeah. I hear anarchists sort of differ about the state, and some say, well, the creation of the state was by, the same people who are fighting against, the working class. And then I hear some people say, well, no, there's a capture of the state by people who are against the working class. And I think whichever one of those is true, I think still the solution is to recapture the state, no matter which you believed was the traditional role of the state. I think now it's time to take control, no matter who had control or who has control.
Yes.
And, yeah.
Well, you always have to fight on several levels, as I've tried to indicate. I mean, if we're talking about kind of mainstream politics at the moment, I certainly think I would want to move in a more progressive direction. There are other more radical fronts in which one can think as well, and perhaps work toward as well at the same time. But yeah, I do think that that's sort of the best that maybe we can hope for sort of in the immediate future, just in terms of real politics. And that would be a significant thing, too, because there is a rather clear and stark ideological difference before us right in mainstream politics right now, which is interesting, between a view that really the government it should be as small as possible, and those who think that government can be a good thing. It does seem to me, I mean, the anarchist question is, again, a very big one that I think for my part I would say, not that I could certainly entertain many critiques of the state and of the state form, but it seems to me that with regard to economics, the state is not in its essence either pro-capitalist or anti-capitalist. I mean, I think that can be sort of demonstrated. There can be many kinds of states, and states can act in various ways, which would include, in a paternalistic way, guaranteeing economic and social rights, civil rights, or totalitarian kind of state, which would be the reverse. So I think I would have trouble accepting an intrinsic connection between the state and capitalism as such.
Right. Brian and I often advocate socialism for the next few social forms. And then Brian and I sort of advocate an anarchist, self-independent sort of communities as a social form after that, once they've become, in charge of their own destinies and they've become educated and able to sort of sustain on their own. And then we can sort of talk about cutting the state away. But I think the next social form would be something like socialism, if we're serious about creating a more equal and more fair society. So you'll get a little bit of, you hear a lot of socialism and anarchism from this show. So
yes. Well, this is one of the great big questions now, because at one level anarchism can seem to resemble sort of libertarianism and can seem to sort of dovetail with a kind of Paul Ryan, as we were talking about, position. And I understand, of course, there are also left-wing modes of anarchism and so forth. So that's the tricky thing about this.
Yeah, and none of us know the final social form even after socialism. So it's sort of, we'll have to come to those questions when we get to them. But yeah,
absolutely.
But yeah, we're actually about out of time for today's episode. So I want to thank my guest, Professor Scott Shershow.
Thank you.
Yep. And go ahead and check us out next week again on 90.3 KDVS, the Anarchist Handbook.